In the depths of a Florentine prison, Niccolò Machiavelli contemplated the nature of power with a clarity that only suffering can provide. Stripped of his position, tortured on the rack, and exiled from the political stage that had been his life, he discovered a truth that would echo through centuries. The greatest battles are not fought on bloodied fields or in marble halls, but within the fortress of the self. Power, he realized, does not begin with the manipulation of others, the accumulation of wealth, or the commanding of armies. It begins with something far more fundamental and infinitely more difficult: the unwavering respect one holds for oneself. This principle stands as the first command of power, the cornerstone upon which all authority, influence, and personal sovereignty rest. Yet it remains the most violated law among those who seek greatness. Men and women spend lifetimes pursuing external validation, collecting titles and treasures, building empires of sand, all while the foundation of their being crumbles from neglect. They wonder why respect eludes them, why loyalty proves fleeting, why power slips through their fingers like water. The answer lies not in the actions of others, but in the silent betrayals they commit against themselves each day. The world operates on a brutal calculus. People instinctively sense the relationship you hold with yourself, though they may never articulate this perception. Like animals detecting fear through scent, humans detect self-disrespect through 1,000 subtle signals: the apology that comes too quickly, the boundary that dissolves under the slightest pressure, the promise made to oneself and immediately broken, the voice that becomes smaller when it should grow larger. These signals broadcast a message clearer than words. Here stands someone who does not value themselves, and therefore, someone who need not be valued by others. Machiavelli observed the courts and councils of Renaissance Italy with an unflinching eye. He watched as princes who postured and preened lost their territories to quieter men who possessed an unshakable core. He saw how ambassadors who arrived begging for respect returned home empty-handed, while those who emanated self-assurance found doors opening before they knocked. The pattern revealed itself again and again. Those who respected themselves commanded respect as naturally as fire produces warmth. Those who did not, regardless of their titles or armies, were treated with the contempt they unconsciously invited. But what does it mean to respect oneself? The question proves more complex than it initially appears. Self-respect is not arrogance that brittle shell men construct to hide their insecurities. It is not the loud assertion of superiority or the constant need to diminish others. These are the behaviors of those who respect themselves least, who must steal value from others because they have failed to cultivate it within. True self-respect operates differently. It is the quiet certainty that your existence has inherent worth, that your time possesses value, that your boundaries deserve recognition, and that your word, especially the word given to yourself, must be honored above all others. Consider how most people treat themselves in the privacy of their own minds. The internal dialogue would be considered cruel if directed at a stranger, yet they accept it as normal when aimed inward. They make commitments to themselves and break them without consequence, teaching themselves that their own word means nothing. They allow others to violate their boundaries, sending the message that their space, time, and peace are available for casual invasion. They apologize for their existence, for taking up space, for having needs, for being human. Then they wonder why the world treats them as dispensable. The marketplace of human interaction operates on perceived value, and the first valuation comes from within. When you treat yourself as valuable, others follow suit. When you treat yourself as expendable, you should not be surprised when others use you and discard you without thought. This is not cruelty on their part, it is merely acceptance of the value you have assigned yourself. You have set the price, and the market has responded accordingly. Machiavelli understood that power exists primarily as a psychological phenomenon. The prince who doubts his right to rule has already lost his throne, even if he still sits upon it. The general who lacks faith in his own judgment has defeated himself before the battle begins. The courtier who apologizes for his ambitions will never achieve them. Self-respect functions as the foundation of personal sovereignty, the bedrock upon which all forms of power must be built. Without it, every achievement becomes hollow, every success temporary, every relationship transactional and unstable. The man who respects himself moves through the world differently. He does not beg for opportunities but creates them. He does not seek permission to exist but asserts his presence as a matter of fact. When he speaks, he expects to be heard, not because he demands attention, but because he has trained himself to recognize that his thoughts have value and deserve consideration. When others attempt to diminish him, they encounter resistance, not the frantic defense of the insecure, but the immovable boundary of someone who knows their worth. This principle applies regardless of external circumstances. Machiavelli himself demonstrated this truth during his years of exile. Stripped of position and influence, living in poverty on a small farm, he could have dissolved into bitterness and self-pity. Instead, he maintained his dignity, continued his intellectual pursuits, and produced works that would influence leaders for centuries. His external circumstances had changed, but his internal sovereignty remained intact. He understood that while others might strip him of title and wealth, they could not touch the respect he held for himself unless he permitted it. The world constantly tests this principle, daily. Situations arise that invite self-betrayal. Someone demands your time without offering respect. An opportunity appears that requires the abandonment of your values. A relationship offers comfort in exchange for dignity. Social pressure suggests that your boundaries are unreasonable, your standards too high, your expectations of yourself and others excessive. These are the moments that define whether self-respect is real or merely performed. Most fail these tests without recognizing they are being tested. They compromise once, then twice, then so frequently that compromise becomes their default position. Each concession weakens the foundation. Each self-betrayal makes the next one easier, until they no longer remember what they stood for or who they meant to become. They look around at lives that feel hollow and relationships that leave them empty, wondering what went wrong. The answer is always the same. Somewhere along the path, they stopped respecting themselves, and the world responded accordingly. The tragedy lies not merely in the personal suffering this causes, but in the unnecessary nature of it. Self-respect is not a limited resource that must be hoarded or fought over. It does not require permission from others or validation from external sources. It is freely available to anyone willing to claim it and defend it. Yet most people act as though they must earn the right to respect themselves, as though some external authority must grant them permission to value their own existence. They wait for the promotion, the relationship, the achievement, the recognition, always looking outward for something that can only be found within. Machiavelli saw this pattern in the princes he advised. They sought power over others while lacking power over themselves. They wished to be feared and respected while demonstrating through their actions that they feared and respected themselves too little to maintain consistent principles. They wanted loyalty from subjects while showing no loyalty to their own values. The result was predictable: temporary gains followed by inevitable collapse. Power built on the foundation of self-disrespect cannot stand because it lacks structural integrity. It is a tower built on sand, impressive from a distance but doomed to fall at the first strong wind. The alternative path requires brutal honesty. It demands that you examine the ways you betray yourself daily, the promises made and broken, the boundaries drawn and abandoned, the values proclaimed and violated, the voice within that you silence to keep peace with others, the dreams deferred indefinitely, the disrespect accepted to avoid confrontation, the slow death of the authentic self through 1,000 small concessions. This examination proves painful because it reveals the truth. In many cases, you are your own worst enemy, your own harshest oppressor, your own most consistent saboteur. But this recognition, however painful, contains liberation. If you are the source of your own disrespect, then you also hold the power to change it. You need not wait for others to grant you value. You need not achieve some arbitrary standard before you deserve your own respect. You can begin immediately, this moment, to treat yourself as someone worthy of dignity, boundaries, and consideration. This decision, this fundamental shift in how you relate to yourself, changes everything. The process begins with small acts of self-respect that gradually accumulate into a transformed existence. It starts with keeping the promises you make to yourself, however minor. If you commit to waking at a certain time, you wake at that time. If you promise yourself you will complete a task, you complete it, not for others, not for external reward, but because your word, especially to yourself, must mean something. Each kept promise reinforces the message that you take yourself seriously, that you are someone whose commitments have weight and consequence. It continues with the establishment and maintenance of boundaries. This means learning to say no without guilt, to refuse demands on your time and energy that do not serve your growth, to walk away from situations and people who require your self-diminishment as the price of admission. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate you, but rather the definition of where you end and others begin. They declare what you will accept and what you will not, what behavior toward you is permissible, and what will result in consequences. People with weak boundaries live in constant confusion about why they feel exhausted and exploited. The answer is simple. When you have no boundaries, everything can enter and take what it wishes. Self-respect requires that you defend your boundaries even when doing so proves difficult or unpopular. Especially then. The boundary that caves under pressure was never truly a boundary, but merely a suggestion, easily ignored by anyone with sufficient persistence. When you defend your boundaries consistently, you train others in how to treat you. Some will resist initially, especially those who benefited from your previous lack of limits. Their resistance is not a sign that your boundaries are wrong, but rather confirmation that they are necessary. People accustomed to unlimited access will always protest when limits appear, but their comfort is not your responsibility. The transformation deepens when you begin to eliminate toxic self-talk, that constant stream of criticism and diminishment most people direct at themselves. Pay attention to your internal dialogue for a single day and you will likely be shocked by its cruelty. You call yourself names you would never tolerate from others. You interpret mistakes as evidence of fundamental unworthiness. You magnify flaws while dismissing strengths. You hold yourself to impossible standards while accepting mediocrity from those around you. This pattern must be interrupted and replaced with something more constructive. This does not mean delusional positive thinking or the denial of genuine flaws. It means treating yourself with the same basic courtesy you would extend to someone you respect. When you make a mistake, you acknowledge it without catastrophizing. When you fall short, you analyze what went wrong without declaring yourself worthless. When you succeed, you actually allow yourself to feel satisfaction rather than immediately moving to the next challenge. You speak to yourself as someone valuable enough to deserve honest but compassionate feedback rather than constant abuse. Machiavelli recognized that men are often their own harshest judges, more cruel to themselves in private than any enemy would dare to be in public. This internal tyrant must be overthrown before any external throne can be claimed. The revolution begins in the space between your ears, in the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve. As long as those stories center on unworthiness, inadequacy, and shame, no amount of external success will ever feel like enough. You will achieve and achieve, climbing ever higher while feeling ever emptier because you are trying to solve an internal problem with external solutions. True self-respect also manifests in how you invest your time and energy. Time is the ultimate non-renewable resource, and how you spend it reveals what you truly value. When you consistently give your prime hours to others' priorities while relegating your own dreams to whatever scraps remain, you send a clear message about whose life matters more. When you sacrifice your health, your growth, your peace of mind in service of goals that leave you feeling hollow, you demonstrate practical disrespect for yourself regardless of what you claim to believe. The self-respecting person treats their time as precious because they understand that time is life itself. They are selective about where they invest attention and energy, recognizing that every yes to one thing is necessarily a no to something else. They protect their capacity for deep work, meaningful relationships, and personal restoration. They understand that being busy is not the same as being productive, and that the appearance of selflessness often masks the reality of self-abandonment. This selectivity often attracts criticism from others who benefited from your previous availability. They will call you selfish when you are merely being self-respecting. They will suggest that your new boundaries reflect negative character changes when really they reflect positive growth. They will attempt to guilt you back into your old patterns by questioning your loyalty, your kindness, your commitment. This is the test. Will you maintain your respect for yourself in the face of pressure, or will you collapse back into the familiar pattern of self-sacrifice that left you depleted and resentful? The answer determines everything. Those who maintain their boundaries through this pressure discover something remarkable. Many relationships survive the transition and become healthier, while those that cannot survive were likely toxic to begin with. You lose access to people who valued you only for what you provided, but you create space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. The quality of your connections improves even as the quantity may decrease. This trade proves worthwhile because respect without reciprocity is not actually respect but servitude dressed in prettier language. Understanding this principle requires examining the relationship between self-respect and external respect. Many believe these operate independently, that you can lack respect for yourself while still commanding respect from others, or that you can respect yourself while the world treats you with contempt. Both beliefs are false. Self-respect and external respect exist in a feedback loop, each reinforcing or undermining the other. People unconsciously mirror the energy you project about yourself. When you treat yourself with dignity, others follow suit. When you treat yourself as disposable, they take you at your word. This explains why certain individuals command respect without obvious external markers of success. They may lack wealth, status, or conventional power, yet others instinctively treat them with consideration. The source of this respect is internal. Something in how they carry themselves, how they speak, how they respond to challenges communicates that they value themselves. This communication happens largely below conscious awareness, through micro-expressions, tone of voice, posture, and 1,000 subtle signals that declare, "Here stands someone who knows their worth." Conversely, this explains why some people with every external marker of success feel perpetually disrespected. Despite their achievements, wealth, or position, others treat them with casual contempt. They wonder why their authority is constantly questioned, their boundaries violated, their contributions minimized. The answer lies in the disconnect between their external accomplishments and their internal relationship with themselves. All the success in the world cannot mask the signals of self-disrespect, and others respond to those signals instinctively. Machiavelli would recognize this as another example of the gap between appearance and reality that fascinated him throughout his work. A prince might appear powerful, sitting on a throne, wearing a crown, commanding armies, while actually being weak because he has not conquered himself. Meanwhile, a prisoner in chains might be truly powerful because he has achieved internal sovereignty that no external force can touch. The appearance of power proves nothing. Real power stems from self-mastery, and self-mastery begins with self-respect. The first part of this journey involves radical honesty about where you currently stand. Most people avoid this examination because they intuitively understand it will be uncomfortable. It is easier to blame external circumstances, other people, bad luck, or an unjust world than to acknowledge the ways you have abandoned yourself. But transformation cannot begin with comfortable delusions. It must start with the truth, however harsh that truth may be. Ask yourself these questions with brutal honesty. Do you keep the promises you make to yourself, or are they suggestions you discard at the first inconvenience? Do you maintain your boundaries when tested, or do they collapse under social pressure? Do you speak to yourself with respect, or is your internal dialogue a constant stream of criticism and contempt? Do you protect your time as valuable, or do you give it away freely to anyone who asks? Do you pursue your own goals with the same energy you devote to others' needs, or do your dreams always take last priority? Do you accept behavior from others that you would never tolerate if directed at someone you loved? The answers to these questions reveal the true state of your self-respect. If you find yourself wanting in these areas, do not despair. The first step toward change is acknowledging the need for it. You cannot fix problems you refuse to see, cannot heal wounds you pretend do not exist, cannot build self-respect on a foundation of denial. The honest recognition of where you are becomes the starting point for where you might go. This recognition leads naturally into the second phase of the journey, the deliberate destruction of the weak self that has dominated your existence. This proves the most difficult part of the transformation because it requires killing patterns, habits, and identities that feel like essential parts of who you are. In reality, they are prison cells you have mistaken for your home, chains you have worn so long they feel like jewelry. The weak self is not simply a collection of bad habits or unfortunate circumstances. It is a complete identity structure built on fear, scarcity, and the desperate need for external validation. It is the voice that tells you to stay small so as not to threaten others, to apologize for your ambitions, to accept less than you deserve because more might be too much to ask. It is the pattern of thinking that sees every situation through the lens of what you might lose rather than what you might gain. It is the constant calculation of how to please, appease, and accommodate others while abandoning yourself in the process. This weak self developed through years of conditioning. Perhaps it began in childhood, when you learned that certain parts of yourself were unacceptable and must be hidden or destroyed to maintain love and approval. Perhaps it crystallized in adolescence, when the need to belong felt like a matter of survival and you twisted yourself into shapes that fit better with the group. Perhaps it solidified in adulthood, through a series of betrayals, failures, and disappointments that taught you the world is dangerous and you must make yourself small and pliable to survive in it. Regardless of its origin, the weak self has outlived whatever usefulness it once possessed. What began as a survival strategy in one context has become a prison in another. The behaviors that perhaps protected you as a powerless child now limit you as an adult with agency and choice. The patterns that helped you navigate one set of circumstances now sabotage you in entirely different situations. The weak self cannot adapt. because it is built on fear, and fear's primary goal is always to avoid danger rather than to pursue growth. Destroying this weak self requires understanding that it will not go quietly. It has controlled your life for years, possibly decades. It has shaped your decisions, filtered your perceptions, and limited your possibilities. It has become comfortable, familiar, even comforting in its predictability. The weak self knows what to expect. Disappointment, yes, but familiar disappointment. Limitation, certainly, but comfortable limitation. The prospect of its death triggers panic because it represents a leap into the unknown. This is why so many people who recognize the need for change nonetheless remain unchanged. They see the prison clearly, understand its walls are unnecessary, yet cannot bring themselves to walk through the door. The weak self whispers its warnings. What if you try and fail? What if people reject the real you? What if you discover that your authentic self is even less acceptable than the diminished version you have been presenting? Better to stay small and safe than to risk total annihilation. These fears must be confronted directly, rather than rationalized away. The weak self is correct about one thing. There is no guarantee that people will respond well to the new you. Some relationships will not survive your growth. Certain opportunities built on your previous compliance may evaporate when you establish boundaries. The change will be uncomfortable, disorienting, and at times painful. These are not possibilities but certainties. However, the weak self's calculation is incomplete. It focuses obsessively on what might be lost while ignoring what has already been lost and what might be gained. You have already paid an enormous price for remaining small. Dreams deferred indefinitely, relationships that feel hollow, a persistent sense that you are living someone else's life rather than your own, the slow death of authenticity, the exhaustion of constant self-monitoring and self-suppression. This price compounds daily, accumulating into a debt of unrealized potential and unexpressed being that becomes harder to bear with each passing year. Meanwhile, the potential gains of destroying the weak self are extraordinary. Imagine living authentically, expressing yourself without constant calculation of how others might respond. Imagine relationships built on who you actually are rather than who you pretend to be. Imagine pursuing goals that genuinely matter to you rather than goals chosen to impress others or meet their expectations. Imagine the energy freed up when you stop contorting yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. Imagine sleeping peacefully because you are no longer at war with yourself. This is not fantasy but the actual experience of those who complete this transformation. They report feeling lighter, as though an enormous weight has been lifted. They describe discovering energy and creativity they did not know they possessed. They find that relationships become simpler and more authentic, even if fewer in number. They experience a sense of alignment between their actions and their values that brings profound satisfaction. Most importantly, they discover that the catastrophes predicted by the weak self, total rejection, complete failure, devastating loss, rarely materialize. And when challenges do arise, they face them from a position of strength rather than weakness. The process of destroying the weak self must be systematic and sustained. It cannot happen through a single moment of decision or a burst of enthusiasm that fades when tested. It requires the patient dismantling of each component that comprises the weak self structure, replacing fear-based patterns with ones rooted in self-respect and authentic power. Begin with awareness. The weak self operates largely below conscious thought, running automatic programs that trigger in response to certain situations. Someone makes a demand on your time, and before you can think, you have agreed despite having no desire or capacity to help. A conflict emerges, and you instinctively move to placate and apologize even when you have done nothing wrong. An opportunity appears that would require you to be visible and take up space, and you immediately find reasons why you are not qualified or why the timing is wrong. These automatic responses must be brought into conscious awareness before they can be changed. Start noticing when the weak self activates. What situations trigger it? Conflict? Potential rejection? The possibility of disappointing someone? Competition? Success? Attention? The triggers vary by individual but tend to cluster around themes of visibility, conflict, and the risk of losing approval. When you notice the trigger activating, pause. This simple pause, this moment of space between stimulus and response, creates the opportunity for choice rather than automatic reaction. In that pause, ask yourself, what would the strong self do in this situation? Not the self you have been, but the self you are becoming. The one who respects their own needs, maintains their boundaries, speaks their truth, and values their own time and energy. Often the answer is immediately clear, and often it is the opposite of what you would normally do. The weak self says yes when it should say no, apologizes when it should stand firm, minimizes when it should claim, and hides when it should shine. The strong self does the opposite. Then comes the most crucial part. Act from the strong self even though it feels foreign and uncomfortable. This is where most people fail. They have the awareness. They know what the strong self would do. But when the moment comes, they cannot bring themselves to do it. The weak self is familiar. Acting from the strong self feels like pretending, like being fake, like trying on clothes that do not fit. This feeling is precisely why you must push through it. The discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong, but evidence that you are doing something different. And different always feels uncomfortable initially. Each time you act from the strong self despite the discomfort, you weaken the weak self's grip. You demonstrate that its fears are exaggerated, that the catastrophes it predicts do not materialize, that you are capable of behaving in ways you previously thought impossible. You create new neural pathways, new default responses, new patterns of being. Gradually, what felt impossibly difficult becomes merely challenging, then uncomfortable, then simply different, and eventually natural. This process must extend to how you speak about yourself, both internally and externally. The weak self has a distinctive vocabulary. Just, sorry, I'm not sure if this makes sense, but I don't want to bother you, maybe, kind of, sort of, I probably shouldn't say this. This language of minimization and preemptive apology must be systematically eliminated. It serves no purpose except to diminish you before others have a chance to, thereby protecting the weak self from the imagined pain of others' diminishment. Replace this language with words that claim rather than apologize. Instead of sorry to bother you, try thank you for your time. Instead of this might be a stupid question, simply ask the question. Instead of I'm just a pass to state your actual role or identity without the diminishing qualifier. Instead of I'm not sure if this makes sense, present your ideas with confidence that they do make sense. And if they need clarification, others can ask. This shift in language reprograms how you think about yourself and signals to others that you have changed the terms of engagement. The weak self also manifests in your relationship with failure and mistakes. It treats any error as confirmation of fundamental unworthiness, as evidence that its fears about your inadequacy are justified. This relationship with failure creates paralysis because the cost of trying and failing feels too high. Better to not try at all than to risk confirming the weak self's darkest beliefs about you. This is how people spend lifetimes in safety, never testing their limits, never discovering what they are capable of becoming. The strong self views failure differently. It understands that failure is information rather than identity, feedback rather than verdict. When something does not work, the strong self analyzes what went wrong, extracts useful lessons, and adjusts approach. It does not conclude I am worthless, but rather that strategy was ineffective. This distinction seems small, but proves transformative. It creates the possibility of learning and growth rather than shame and paralysis. Cultivating this perspective requires practice. When you fail at something, notice your immediate response. If the weak self takes over, you will spiral into self-recrimination and catastrophizing. Stop this spiral by asking different questions. Instead of, why am I so stupid? Ask, what can I learn from this? Instead of, this proves I'll never succeed, ask, what would I do differently next time? Instead of interpreting the failure as evidence about your identity, treat it as data about your approach. This shift extends to how you handle criticism and feedback. The weak self cannot distinguish between useful feedback and personal attack, cannot separate your behavior from your identity. Any criticism feels like an assault on your fundamental worth, triggering defensive reactions or collapse into shame. Neither response serves you. The defensive reaction prevents you from learning anything useful, while the shame response confirms the weak self's narrative about your inadequacy. The strong self can receive feedback without losing itself in the process. It evaluates criticism on its merits. Is this feedback accurate and useful? If yes, integrate it and improve. If no, discard it without drama. The strong self's worth is not dependent on perfect performance or universal approval, so criticism can be processed pragmatically rather than emotionally. This ability to receive feedback without defensive reactivity or personal devastation proves crucial for growth, as the best information about where you need to improve often comes from sources that do not necessarily deliver it gently. Destroying the weak self also requires examining and potentially abandoning identities you have built around your limitations. Many people unconsciously construct identities around being wounded, disadvantaged, or special in their suffering. These identities provide certain benefits. They excuse failure, attract sympathy, absolve you of responsibility for change. But they also lock you into patterns that prevent growth. You cannot simultaneously identify as helpless and develop personal power. You cannot both embrace victimhood and claim agency. This does not mean denying real hardships or challenges you have faced. It means refusing to let those challenges define you or limit what you might become. The question is not what happened to you, but what you do with what happened. Do you use your past as an excuse for stagnation or as fuel for transformation? Do you let your wounds define you, or do you define yourself through how you respond to those wounds? This choice belongs entirely to you, though the weak self will insist otherwise. The weak self wants you to believe that you are a product of your circumstances, helpless before the forces that shaped you. This narrative protects it from the terror of responsibility. If you are merely a victim of circumstances, then you cannot be blamed for remaining weak. But this protection comes at an enormous cost. It robs you of agency, of the power to choose differently, to become someone new. True self-respect requires accepting responsibility for who you are now and who you become going forward, regardless of how you got here. This brings us to one of the most challenging aspects of destroying the weak self, the necessity of solitude in the transformation process. The weak self developed partially through your relationships and social environment. Certain people in your life are invested in you remaining weak because it serves their needs. They benefit from your lack of boundaries, your willingness to abandon yourself to accommodate them, your inability to say no. These people will resist your transformation, sometimes overtly, but more often through subtle manipulations designed to pull you back into familiar patterns. This is why periods of deliberate solitude prove crucial during major transformation. You need space away from the social forces that shape the weak self to discover who you might become outside those influences. This does not require physical isolation, but rather psychological space to hear your own voice without the constant chorus of others' expectations, judgments, and needs. In solitude, you can examine your beliefs and discover which ones are actually yours and which you absorbed from others without question. Many people fear solitude because the weak self protests loudly in silence. Without external distraction and validation, you must confront yourself directly. The thoughts you have been avoiding surface. The truths you have been denying become impossible to ignore. The gap between who you are and who you might be appears in stark relief. This confrontation proves uncomfortable, which is precisely why it is necessary. You cannot destroy the weak self while constantly running from it into the arms of distraction. In solitude, practice sitting with discomfort without immediately seeking to alleviate it. Notice the urge to check your phone, to seek social validation, to distract yourself with consumption or entertainment. Do not judge these urges, but do not automatically indulge them either. Instead, stay present with whatever arises. Feel the anxiety, the restlessness, the doubt. Observe these sensations without being consumed by them. This practice builds the capacity to tolerate discomfort, a crucial skill because growth lives on the other side of comfort. The weak self also maintains its grip through certain relationships that reinforce your smallness. These might be family members who resist your growth because it threatens the family system's equilibrium. They might be friends who bond with you over shared complaints and limitations, who subtly undermine your aspirations to keep you at their level. They might be romantic partners who selected you specifically for your weakness, who feel threatened by your strength. These relationships must be evaluated honestly. This evaluation proves painful because it often reveals that people you love do not support your growth. They may say they want the best for you, while simultaneously sabotaging your progress. They may claim to celebrate your success while subtly undercutting it. They may demand you change in ways they find convenient while resisting changes that disrupt their comfort. This is not necessarily malicious on their part. People are complex and often contradictory. But regardless of their intentions, the effect on you is the same. They anchor you to the weak self. The choice then becomes whether to maintain these relationships and accept that they will always contain elements of sabotage, or to create distance and risk losing connections that have been important to you. Neither choice is easy, but one choice allows transformation, while the other prevents it. The strong self understands that not all relationships survive growth. and that this is acceptable. Better to lose relationships that require your diminishment than to lose yourself to maintain relationships. As you progress in destroying the weak self, you will notice something remarkable. New people and opportunities appear. This is not mystical but practical. When you change your energy and behavior, you attract different responses from the world. The people who resonated with your weakness drift away, while those who recognize and respect strength gravitate toward you. The opportunities that required you to stay small close off, while those that demand more of you open up. Your world reorganizes itself around your new center. This reorganization can feel disorienting. The familiar landmarks of your previous life disappear while new territory remains unexplored and uncertain. The weak self uses this disorientation as evidence that you have made a terrible mistake, that you should return to the familiar patterns that at least you understand. Do not listen. This disorientation is not a sign you have gone wrong, but evidence that you are actually changing. Real transformation disrupts everything. If your life remains comfortable and unchanged, you have not actually transformed, but merely rearranged surface elements while the core remains the same. The destruction of the weak self reaches completion not through a single dramatic moment, but through accumulated small victories that eventually reach a tipping point. Each time you maintain a boundary when pressured, you chip away at the weak self structure. Each time you speak your truth despite potential consequences, you weaken its foundation. Each time you honor a commitment to yourself, you prove it wrong about your capabilities. Each time you treat yourself with the respect you deserve, you demonstrate that another way of being is possible. Eventually, the balance shifts. The strong self becomes your default rather than something you must consciously access. The behaviors that once required enormous effort become natural. The boundaries that felt impossible to maintain become easy. The self-respect you had to deliberately cultivate becomes automatic. You look back and barely recognize the person you were. Cannot imagine returning to those patterns, wonder how you tolerated them for so long. This is the victory, not the destruction of the weak self in service of some external goal, but the liberation it provides to finally become who you actually are rather than who fear and conditioning shaped you to be. The strong self that emerges is not a construction or performance, but a revelation of what was always present beneath the layers of protective weakness. You do not create this self. You uncover it by removing everything false. The man who completes this transformation, who destroys the weak self and claims authentic power, discovers something that Machiavelli understood but that most miss in their reading of his work. Invincibility is not about external dominance but internal sovereignty. The truly powerful person is not the one who can destroy others, but the one who cannot be destroyed by them. External power proves temporary and circumstantial. Internal power, rooted in unshakable self-respect, endures regardless of external circumstances. This invincibility does not mean nothing can harm you. You remain subject to the same vulnerabilities as everyone else. Physical injury, loss, betrayal, failure, death. The difference lies not in the events themselves, but in how they impact your core being. The weak self can be destroyed by rejection because it depends on approval for its sense of worth. The weak self can be shattered by failure because it interprets failure as confirmation of inadequacy. The weak self can be manipulated through fear because it operates from a place of perceived deficit and constant threat. The strong self, by contrast, maintains its center regardless of external circumstances. Rejection hurts but does not devastate because worth comes from within rather than without. Failure disappoints but does not define because identity is separate from performance. Threats can be evaluated pragmatically rather than triggering panic because the strong self does not operate from constant fear of annihilation. This stability makes you effectively invincible to the psychological weapons that control most people. Consider how most people can be controlled. Threaten their reputation, and they will compromise their values to protect their image. Withhold approval, and they will contort themselves seeking validation. Question their worth, and they will scramble to prove themselves. Offer acceptance conditional on compliance, and they will abandon their authenticity. These psychological pressure points work only on those who lack internal sovereignty, who depend on external sources for their sense of self. The person with genuine self-respect cannot be controlled through these mechanisms. Threaten their reputation, and they shrug because their self-worth does not depend on others' opinions. Withhold approval, and they remain unchanged because they have learned to approve of themselves. Question their worth, and they smile, because only they determine their value. Offer conditional acceptance, and they walk away because they would rather be alone than inauthentic. This makes them dangerous to those who are accustomed to controlling others because the usual tools of manipulation bounce off harmlessly. This invincibility manifests practically in all areas of life. In the professional realm, the self-respecting person proves difficult to exploit. They know their value and demand compensation accordingly. They refuse to work in environments that require self-diminishment. They set boundaries around their time and energy. They walk away from opportunities that compromise their integrity, understanding that some prices are too high regardless of the reward. This selectivity means they often earn less initially than those willing to accept any terms, but over time, their refusal to be undervalued positions them for opportunities that actually appreciate their worth. In relationships, invincibility through self-respect transforms dynamics entirely. The desperate neediness that characterizes weak self-relationships disappears. You can appreciate people without needing them to complete you. You can enjoy connection without fearing solitude. You can love without losing yourself in the process. This creates healthier relationships because you show up as a complete person, seeking connection with another complete person, rather than as a half person desperate to fuse with someone else to feel whole. This does not mean emotional independence to the point of coldness. The strong self can be vulnerable, can need others, can feel deeply, but this vulnerability comes from a place of strength rather than weakness. You choose to open yourself to someone rather than being unable to exist without them. You value their presence in your life rather than depending on them for your sense of identity. When they leave or disappoint you, it hurts but does not destroy you because your core remains intact. The invincibility born of self-respect also changes how you handle conflict. Most people either avoid conflict entirely or engage in it destructively. They avoid because the weak self fears confrontation, or they engage destructively because buried resentment explodes in disproportionate rage. Neither approach serves them well. Conflict avoided festers and accumulates until relationships buckle under the weight of unaddressed issues. Conflict engaged destructively damages relationships and resolves nothing. The strong self approaches conflict differently. Conflict is simply a natural result of different people having different needs, preferences, and perspectives. It need not be personal or catastrophic. When conflict arises, the strong self addresses it directly, but without drama. They state their position clearly, listen to the other perspective, and work toward resolution. If resolution proves impossible, they make decisions about whether the relationship can continue and on what terms. Throughout this process, they maintain respect for themselves and the other person, even if they ultimately choose to separate. This ability to engage conflict constructively without collapse or explosion proves crucial for all meaningful relationships. No relationship of any depth can avoid conflict entirely. The question is whether conflict destroys the relationship or deepens it through honest engagement. The weak self cannot engage conflict constructively because any disagreement feels like existential threat. The strong self understands that healthy relationships survive and even strengthen through working through differences rather than pretending they do not exist. In the realm of decision-making, invincibility through self-respect provides clarity that eludes most people. Decisions become simpler when you have clear values and consistent respect for yourself. Many of the decisions that torment people for weeks or months resolve quickly when filtered through these principles. Does this choice respect your values or require you to compromise them? Does this opportunity demand growth or diminishment? Does this relationship add to your life or subtract from it? The answers often become obvious when you commit to self-respect as your primary criterion. This does not mean all decisions become easy. Complex situations with competing goods remain complex. But the complexity comes from genuinely difficult trade-offs, rather than from the internal warfare between what you want and what you think you should want, between who you are and who you are pretending to be. When you eliminate the layer of inauthenticity, decision-making becomes more straightforward even when it remains difficult. The invincible person also possesses a quality that most people spend lifetimes seeking but looking in the wrong places: peace. Not the peace of having everything you want, but the peace of being at peace with yourself. This peace stems from alignment between your values and your behavior, between who you are privately and who you present publicly, between what you believe and how you act. Most people live in constant internal conflict, advocating for certain values while violating them daily, claiming certain identities while behaving in contradictory ways. This dissonance creates perpetual anxiety that no amount of external success can alleviate. When you destroy the weak self and commit to genuine self-respect, this dissonance dissolves. You become integrated rather than fragmented. The various parts of yourself that were at war make peace. The energy previously spent on internal conflict becomes available for external achievement. You sleep better because you are not haunted by self-betrayals. You move through the world with a quiet confidence that comes not from thinking you are better than others, but from no longer thinking you are worse. This peace attracts people while simultaneously making you less desperate for their approval, a paradox that proves extraordinarily beneficial. People instinctively gravitate toward those who are at peace with themselves. There is something magnetic about someone who has resolved their internal conflicts and achieved self-respect. They seem more alive, more present, more real than those still trapped in the performance of the weak self. Yet because they have done the work of building internal sovereignty, they do not need this attraction or attention. They enjoy connection but do not depend on it, which paradoxically makes them even more attractive. The invincibility of the strong self also provides resilience during inevitable setbacks and losses. Life delivers suffering regardless of how much self-respect you possess. People die. Relationships end. Projects fail. Bodies age and break down. Circumstances change beyond your control. The difference lies in how these events affect you. The weak self is shattered by loss because it has built its sense of self on external things, other people's approval, specific achievements, particular circumstances. When these external supports collapse, the weak self collapses with them. The strong self experiences the same events but is not destroyed by them. Grief is felt deeply but does not become identity. Loss is mourned but does not mean the end of meaning. Failure stings but does not invalidate worth. The strong self bends under pressure but does not break because its foundation is internal rather than external. This is true invincibility, not the absence of vulnerability, but the presence of a core that endures regardless of what happens around it. Machiavelli observed this quality in the historical figures he admired most. They were not men who never faced defeat or betrayal, but men who maintained themselves through these trials. They adapted to changed circumstances without losing their essential nature. They suffered setbacks without collapsing into helplessness. They faced death itself with equanimity, because their sense of self did not depend on continued existence. This ability to maintain sovereignty even in destruction represents the ultimate achievement of power. This perspective transforms your relationship with mortality itself. The weak self fears death desperately because death represents the ultimate loss of control and the final negation of all its projects of self-aggrandizement. The strong self acknowledges death as inevitable, but refuses to let fear of death control how it lives. Better to live authentically for a short time than to live authentically forever. Better to die having become yourself than to survive without ever discovering who you were. This does not mean reckless disregard for survival or romantic glorification of death. It means recognizing that if you spend your life in service of avoiding death through absolute safety, you have already died in the ways that matter. You have sacrificed your actual life, your capacity for growth, for authentic connection, for meaningful achievement, for self-expression, on the altar of mere survival. This is the tragedy of the weak self. It prioritizes survival over living and ends up doing neither well. The strong self lives fully precisely because it has made peace with mortality. Knowing that time is finite, it refuses to waste precious years in self-betrayal and inauthenticity. Every day spent aligned with your values is a day lived fully. Every moment of genuine self-expression is a moment of victory over the forces that would diminish you. Every instance of maintained self-respect is a small triumph that accumulates into a life well lived. This brings us to the final transformation that occurs in those who destroy the weak self. They stop seeking to be invincible and discover they already are. The weak self was always seeking something external to complete it, to make it safe, to prove its worth. It believed invincibility would come from wealth or status or love or achievement. It spent lifetimes pursuing these things while remaining fundamentally vulnerable because vulnerability was internal rather than external. The strong self realizes that invincibility was never about acquiring something you lack, but about recognizing what you already possess. You have always had inherent worth, you just needed to acknowledge it. You have always had the power to set boundaries. You just needed to exercise it. You have always been capable of respecting yourself. You just needed to choose it. The transformation is not about becoming someone new, but about removing the layers of false self that obscured who you always were. This recognition brings profound freedom. You realize you have been carrying around a self-imposed prison, that the walls that constrained you were ones you built or allowed others to build. You understand that at any moment you could have chosen differently, could have claimed your sovereignty, could have lived from the strong self rather than the weak one. This realization can trigger regret for time wasted, but it can also ignite gratitude for time remaining. Better to wake up now than never. Better to live the rest of your life from strength than to continue indefinitely from weakness. The practical application of invincibility through self-respect extends to every domain of life. In your work, it means showing up as your authentic self, rather than performing a role you think others expect. It means taking credit for your contributions, rather than minimizing them. It means advocating for proper compensation and treatment, rather than accepting whatever is offered. It means walking away from situations that require self-betrayal, regardless of the short-term cost. In your personal life, it means maintaining boundaries even with loved ones, perhaps especially with loved ones who are most practiced at transgressing them. It means saying no without excessive explanation or apology. It means ending relationships that consistently diminish you regardless of how long they have existed. It means choosing solitude over company that leaves you feeling empty. It means investing in yourself with the same devotion you have previously reserved for others. In your inner world, it means treating your own thoughts, feelings, and needs as valid and worthy of consideration. It means stopping the constant self-criticism and replacing it with the kind of firm but compassionate self-evaluation you would offer a good friend. It means keeping promises to yourself with the same seriousness you bring to promises made to others. It means defending yourself from your own harsh judgments the way you would defend someone you love from a bully. These practices accumulate into a transformed life. People often describe this transformation as finally feeling like themselves, as coming home to who they were always meant to be. The relief is palpable because maintaining the weak self required enormous energy. The constant self-monitoring, the perpetual calculation of what others want, the suppression of authentic desires, the performance of acceptable emotions while hiding real ones, all of this consumed resources that now become available for actual living. With these resources freed up, capacities emerge that were previously dormant. Creativity flourishes when you stop self-censoring every impulse that might be judged. Relationships deepen when you show up authentically rather than performing acceptability. Achievement accelerates when energy previously spent on internal conflict redirects toward external goals. Life becomes simpler not because challenges disappear, but because you are no longer simultaneously facing external challenges and internal warfare. This transformation also changes your relationship with success and failure in fundamental ways. The weak self needed success desperately to prove worth and feared failure as confirmation of inadequacy. This made both success and failure into high-stakes identity dramas rather than simply data points about particular approaches to particular problems. The strong self can enjoy success without needing it to validate existence, and can learn from failure without interpreting it as personal indictment. This shift liberates you to take bigger risks because the costs of failure become manageable. When failure means only "this approach did not work," rather than "I am worthless," you can try things that might not work. This willingness to risk failure paradoxically increases the likelihood of success because you attempt things others avoid. Most people trap themselves in the realm of sure things, never testing their upper limits, never discovering what they could achieve if they were willing to fail spectacularly. The invincible person, by contrast, swings for the fences regularly. Sometimes they miss entirely. Sometimes they strike out repeatedly, but sometimes they connect. And when they do, the results far exceed what careful, cautious people ever achieve. More importantly, even the failures feel different. Instead of crushing defeats that require months of recovery, they become data points and learning experiences. You brush yourself off, extract useful lessons, adjust your approach, and try again. This resilience in the face of failure represents one of the most practical benefits of invincibility through self-respect. In a world of increasing complexity and rapid change, the ability to fail, learn, and try again proves more valuable than the ability to succeed on the first attempt. The person who can risk and recover proves more adaptive than the person who must succeed immediately. This adaptability becomes a form of practical invincibility, not the ability to never fall, but the ability to always rise. The journey from weak self to strong self, from external dependence to internal sovereignty, from vulnerability to invincibility through self-respect, is not linear or simple. It involves setbacks and regressions. Some days you will act from the strong self effortlessly. Other days, the weak self will reassert control, and you will find yourself repeating patterns you thought you had transcended. God, this is normal and to be expected. Transformation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. What matters is the overall trajectory. Are you gradually moving toward greater self-respect and authenticity, even if the path includes detours and backsliding? Are you more often acting from the strong self this month than you were 6 months ago? Are your boundaries firmer, your self-talk kinder, your choices more aligned with your actual values? If the answer is yes, then you are succeeding regardless of how imperfect the process feels. The final paradox of invincibility through self-respect is that it makes you simultaneously stronger and more vulnerable. Stronger because you have built an internal foundation that cannot be easily shaken. More vulnerable because you no longer hide behind the defenses of the weak self. The weak self protects itself through constant performance, through hiding authentic feelings and desires, through preemptive apology and self-diminishment. These defenses prevent genuine connection, but also prevent genuine hurt. The strong self drops these defenses. It shows up authentically, which means showing up with all the genuine vulnerabilities that entails. It admits to caring about things, which creates the possibility of disappointment. It forms deep connections, which means experiencing deep loss when those connections end. It pursues meaningful goals, which means facing meaningful failure when those goals are not achieved. This authentic vulnerability proves far more frightening than the defended posture of the weak self. Yet this vulnerability comes from a place of strength rather than weakness, and that makes all the difference. You are vulnerable because you choose to be, not because you cannot help it. You can close yourself off again if needed, but you choose openness because the rewards outweigh the risks. You understand that being hurt is a possibility, but not a catastrophe, that you have survived everything life has thrown at you so far and will likely survive whatever comes next. This confidence transforms vulnerability from a liability into an asset, from something to be hidden into something that deepens connection and experience. In the end, the first command of power, respect yourself or be disrespected, reveals itself as not really about power over others at all. It is about sovereignty over yourself. It is about refusing to be a stranger to your own values, a traitor to your own needs, an enemy to your own potential. It is about building an internal foundation so solid that external circumstances can shake you but never break you. It is about becoming someone who cannot be destroyed by others because you have already destroyed the parts of yourself that were destructible: the fear, the neediness, the dependence on external validation, the willingness to betray yourself for temporary comfort. What remains after this destruction is not a new person, but the person you always were beneath the protective layers of the weak self. This person, authentic, sovereign, invincible through self-respect, was always present, waiting for you to claim them. The journey from weakness to strength is really a journey home to yourself, to the core of being that no circumstance can touch, that no person can destroy, that death itself cannot diminish because it never depended on life's circumstances to begin with. Machiavelli understood this from his prison cell. Stripped of everything external, he discovered what could not be stripped: his mind, his dignity, his sovereignty over his own thoughts and values. He had lost his position, but not his self-respect. He had lost his freedom, but not his internal power. He had lost the game of external politics, but won the only game that ultimately matters: the contest with himself for dominion over his own being. This is the invitation implicit in the first command of power. You can spend your life seeking power over others, accumulating symbols of status and authority, building empires that will crumble to dust. Or you can claim the only power that matters: sovereignty over yourself, expressed through unwavering self-respect. This power makes you invincible not because nothing can harm you, but because nothing can destroy you. You may be knocked down, but you will rise. You may be defeated, but you will not be broken. You may lose everything external, but you will retain the only thing that truly matters: yourself, intact and inviolate, a sovereign territory that exists beyond the reach of circumstance or other people's power. This is what it means to destroy the weak self. Not to become someone different, but to burn away everything false until only truth remains. Not to construct an impressive facade, but to reveal the foundation that was always present beneath the rubble. Not to gain something you lack, but to recognize what you have always possessed: the capacity for self-respect, so complete and unwavering that it grants practical invincibility in a world that constantly seeks to diminish and destroy. The choice is yours. You can continue living from the weak self, seeking validation and power from external sources, remaining vulnerable to every shift in circumstance and opinion. Or you can begin today the work of destroying that weak self and claiming your sovereignty. The path is difficult, the destination uncertain, the journey uncomfortable. But the alternative, a life spent in service to fear, performing for others' approval, betraying yourself daily, proves far more painful in the long run. Respect yourself, or be disrespected. The choice has always been yours, even when you believed otherwise. The power has always resided within you, even when you sought it everywhere else. The invincibility you seek has always been available, not through dominance over others, but through unshakable sovereignty over yourself. Everything else that calls itself power is illusion. This alone is real.